Moi everyone and welcome to Finish Your Plate. Often I get the question, what kind of rye flour should I use for making Finnish rye bread? And the truth is, I don't know. I've used a few different rye flours, but I went ahead and I bought a whole bunch of different flours that I could find. Some from Amazon, some from my local grocery store. And I wanted to see, how do they compare? What's the difference between the different rye flours? I also bought some rye flour from Finland when I was there, so this could be the control, and let's see how it compares when making rye bread. I've also heard that it does make a big difference which kind of rye flour you use, specifically in Finnish rye bread, that some flours do not work as well because of the falling number problem that I've discussed before in my videos. Falling number is basically a measurement of enzymatic activity in flour. If the rye berries start to germinate before they're harvested, it could be because of bad weather, rainy season, whatever, it'll increase the enzymatic activity, amylase enzyme in the flour, and that amylase enzyme will prevent your rye crumb from developing properly. And even a small amounts of amylase enzyme can cause this catastrophic effect on your bread. So if you've ever baked Finnish rye bread and you make a batch and you find out that inside it's just gluey inside and it did not develop that nice crumb, that's what happened. There may not be anything wrong with your recipe or your method, that it is simply the flour that's the problem. Unfortunately, finding out the falling number, it's an actual measurement. There's an actual device that measures the falling number in flour. It's not really that simple because the manufacturers don't publish those numbers. I'm not even sure if they even measure it themselves. You could of course send the flour to a lab for testing, but obviously that's outside the realm of a home cook. And of course in America specifically, because rye is not so popular as wheat, it's often used for other things, maybe in Jewish rye bread, which has a very small proportion of rye flour, especially compared to Finnish rye bread. The falling number is not really that important of a factor, so it's not measured. In either case, I wanted to check out these different flours and let's see what we can find out about the difference between different rye flours. So the first rye flour I have here is this. This is what I pretty much use on day-to-day basis for making rye bread. This is Great River organic rye flour. And this is what 100 grams of flour looks like. Here's our rye flour from Finland. This is organic rye flour. I just picked this up from the store. And this is what 100 grams of Finnish rye flour looks like. This is King Arthur Baking Pumpernickel flour. I've used this in the past and I've been pretty happy with the results that I get from this flour too. And this is what 100 grams of this flour looks like. This is Bob's Red Mill dark rye flour. This flour is pretty readily available in grocery stores, at least around here in the New York area. I've used this in the past too. This is another brand of rye flour that I just found on Amazon. I haven't used this one before, but it looks like it fits the bill. And lastly, this is another flour I bought off of Amazon, and I have not used this flour before, but it is dark rye flour, so let's give it a try. And this is what 100 grams of each flour looks like. My first thoughts are that these two flours that I got off of Amazon, they are very finely ground, whereas maybe the King Arthur Pumpernickel flour is the most roughest grind. So why don't we sift these all and see what the difference is. I used my sifter and sifted all these flours. If at the end of sifting there was some roughage that just wasn't going through, I poured it into the little glass bowl afterwards. As we can see, the Finnish rye flour by far has the most roughage. It is the most coarsely ground of them all. The second one would probably be Bob's Red Mill, and third one would be the King Arthur Pumpernickel flour. These three didn't really have any roughage that was left in the sifter after sifting them. So let's bake a batch of sourdough rye with each of the flour. My regular recipe is 100% hydration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure 300 grams of water in here. I'm going to add a tablespoon of my rye starter. And then I'm going to add 150 grams of flour in here. I'm going to leave it overnight. Then tomorrow I'm going to add another 150 grams of rye flour in here. And then I'm going to let it rise. And then I'm going to bake each one of them and then compare the results. And I will measure out 30 grams of my sourdough starter in each one. Now let's mix it all up. And now in each of these containers, I'm going to pour all of this flour plus 50 grams more. And now let's just mix it all up. Already I'm seeing a big difference between some of them. Like this one is a lot more runny than this one, for example. So to double check that I didn't make any errors when measuring, I'm just going to measure them all. They should all weigh about the same. 300 grams of water plus 150 grams of flour makes 450 grams plus the bowl. But it doesn't matter because the bowl is the same size for each one, so we should get about equal results for each one. 678 grams. 678 grams. 688 grams. Maybe I was a little shoddy with my measurement. 682 grams, still very close. 682 grams. And 684 grams. Now, since I measured the flour per weight, not by volume, you would think that the coarsest ground flour would be the loosest, and the Finnish rye flour definitely seems to be like that. But then there's this one out, which is pretty loose, which seemed to be very finely ground. So that is kind of interesting. I don't necessarily know what the reason is why that happened, but we'll see tomorrow when I bake them what the differences are. Now I'm gonna cover these up, and we're gonna come back tomorrow and add another 150 grams of flour to each one, plus some salt. Since I'm using 2% salt of flour weight, I'm gonna add 6 grams of salt to each one, and then we're gonna bake them. And here are our rye bread starters. I'll see you tomorrow. All right, 12 hours has passed now. Let's take a look at the results. So first thing that we notice is a couple of these doughs are darker than others. These two specifically are darker than, let's say, this one, or even the Finnish one. That's kind of an interesting observation. I'm not really sure. I wonder if it's just because of how much of the kernel of the rye berry has been milled. But at the same time, these were not the most coarsely ground flours. If you remember, the Finnish rye flour was the most coarsely ground, so I would think that that flour has most of the kernel left still in it. Otherwise, they seem to have risen similar amounts, except the ones that were drier. These two seem to have just risen up a little bit more in volume. Whereas this one, the Finnish rye flour, that was the coarsest, and if you remember, it was the loosest of them all, it really hasn't risen as much. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some salt to each one, 6 grams of salt to each one. I'm going to add another 150 grams of flour to each one. Then I'm going to form my bread and bake it. So I'm at 690 grams with the container. I'm going to add 150 grams of flour, so that's going to take it up to 840 grams. So I'm going to make each one of these 840 grams, regardless of what it is now. If you remember, I may have been a little bit careless with the measurement earlier. And of course, what I'm going to do is, after I'm done measuring all this, I'm going to mix the rest of the flour in. So one take already that I have is that you may have to adjust the amount of water based on which flour you're using. But let's wait until the end results are in and see how much of a difference does it make. Okay, so all the flour is in now. I'm gonna let these hydrate and proof maybe for about an hour while I get my baking sheets ready. That's gonna help, especially with the drier doughs, to get the flour all hydrated before I start baking. So now I'm gonna make some rye bread. I'm just going to take my scoop and scoop and last what I'll do is I'm just going to sprinkle on some more rye flour on top. Yeah, this dough is definitely way too dry. Now the King Arthur flour, this is more like the consistency that I like the rye dough to be, which is almost like mousse consistency. Very easy to scoop. Not at all ragged, unlike the thicker doughs that were in earlier. Had I not measured my dough so many times through the process, I would think, especially at the end, I would think that I would have made a mistake in measuring. When you compare these breads, which are way too dry, to these, which look to me like perfect consistency. And here again, Bob's has the same frothy kind of consistency as the King Arthur flour. But here, I think the yield is maybe a little bit short. Let's see. Bob's flour seems to be a little bit on the very wet side. We'll see what difference that makes in the end. Rye flour dough can be very wet anyway. The hydration is super high. So it might not actually be a bad thing. It's more like batter consistency. But I can also see that the yield was not quite as much as with the others. And now the last one, which was our control, the Finnish rye flour. This too is frothy kind of consistency, but unlike Bob's, which was on a very loose side, I feel like this holds its shape pretty well. And you could definitely see that the structure is a lot more coarse because the grind was a lot more coarse. The yield may be just a little short. Let's see if I can make 6. So I'm using 1 large scoop and 1 small scoop per bread. There we go. Just about. I can feel the difference when I form the dough. So now I'm just going to run my dough docker quickly through the patties. So now these are going to go in the oven 550 degrees Fahrenheit at about 290 Celsius. Maybe about 10 minutes or so until they get that nice dark color. And the results are in. These are all the rye breads that I baked. But since there's way too many to fit in the frame, let me take one of the best ones of each tray and let's look at them all together at the same time. Out of all these, if we exclude the control, which is the Finnish rye flour, I think the King Arthur rye flour performed the best. It still had a considerable amount of rice compared to the other ones, and the bread was not at all dry, unlike this one. I think this was a complete failure. I could, however, go back and try with adding more water to this bread and seeing if that makes a difference. It probably will. Bob's did pretty well too, but I've noticed that there's a distinct lack of roughage with the Bob's flour. King Arthur is a little bit more coarsely milled, so it has a little bit more coarse texture, which is kind of what you want in rye bread. Great River was kind of a middle of the pack here, and the PuroRaw was, I would say this is definitely on the dry side too. So another curiosity that I noticed was that these 3 flours have exactly the same nutrition facts, even though obviously they do not perform the same way. They are not equal. I think what happened is they probably went to a database or something like that and got like generic rye flour nutrition facts. King Arthur actually has different nutrition facts. Even though the serving size is the same, 1/4 of a cup, it actually lists that it has 10 fewer calories. But it also says that there's some fat in here. I think they probably performed their own testing and printed that on the package. Let's cut these open and see what the crumb looks like. Also, what I've noticed with the King Arthur bread. This is definitely soft. Here we can see the falling number problem that I talked about earlier. Again, these were all baked with the same exact recipe. Same amount of flour, same amount of water, same amount of starter, and salt. That's it. And look at the crumb on these two. It just does not exist. The bread is just solid. Whereas compared to the Finnish rye bread, look at that crumb. That crumb is awesome. But I wouldn't say that the crumb in the other American flours, King Arthur flour, Great River, and Bob's, I wouldn't say that the crumb is too bad with these. These ones have very beautiful crumb, which is what you want in a rye bread. I think with the Finnish rye flour, the difference really is because it's so much coarser milling, and that's why you have this kind of really beautiful crumb. And you can see when you compare the Great River and the Finnish rye, here's the difference that the milling makes, I think. Let's taste them. Let's start with what's probably going to be my least favorite is these ones. I don't even seem to get that rye flavor in this flour at all. Let's try. It just tastes salty. Let's try the Herbaila. I don't know which one's this. Yeah, Herbaila. Let's try this one. The first one was PuroRaw. At least the Herbaila has a little bit of that rye flavor to it. But the crumb is just disappointing completely. Let's take a look at Great River. Now I'm definitely getting that toasted rye flavor. That is something that Finns love. And King Arthur. Interestingly, King Arthur does not have quite as strong rye flavor as the Great River. That's very interesting. I thought the Great River was mid-range, but taste-wise, I would almost prefer it to King Arthur. Let's see how about Bob's. Yeah, Bob's is maybe just a little bit more rye flavor than King Arthur. Let's try the Finnish one. This is probably the one that I'm most excited to try. I can definitely feel the roughage a lot more in this bread. But let me try this compared to the Great River. Interestingly, I think the Great River has the best flavor of them all. It has a really bold rye flavor. Really, that sourdough rye comes through very nicely, maybe even better than in the Finnish rye bread. Alright, so if I were to rank them taste-wise, Great River, absolutely, that is the best. I'll leave the Finnish one out of the comparison. And next one, it's pretty much tied between King Arthur and Bob's. I would maybe put King Arthur just on the top because I think it's just a little bit coarser grind, coarser mill, and the loaves come out looking a little bit nicer because of that. But Bob's, by no means, is not a bad flour. To recap, taste-wise, Great River, absolutely great flour. It comes out a little flat though in the end as far as texture goes. Maybe adding a little bit more water would help there, or adding a little bit something to increase the proof. I'll have to test that out a little bit. King Arthur, excellent flour. Bob's, also excellent flour. And nothing compares to the Finnish flour, of course, except maybe taste-wise. Taste-wise, this edges out just a little bit. As much as I hate to say it, I think taste-wise, this edges out a little. However, this crumb is just absolutely gorgeous. This is just, I can't put it into words how great looking the crumb is with the Finnish rye flour. Maybe what I'll do is I'll try to find some rye meal specifically and see what the difference is. Another take on the whole test is that you may have to adjust your recipe based on what flour you're using. Like we saw, these two flours were way too dry, and Bob's was just a little bit on the too loose side. I feel like the Great River was also a little bit on the dry side. So you may want to add or subtract a little bit of water either way, depending on how your flour is. Of course, another factor that you're looking for in a flour is consistency. Will all these flours perform consistently batch after batch? If you go back and buy the same brand of flour, will you get the same results? And that's to be seen. But for somebody like King Arthur baking rye flour, I would definitely expect that each bag of flour is going to be performing exactly the same way. And let me know in the comments, if you baked rye flour in the US, which rye flour did you use? What's your favorite rye flour to use for baking rye bread? Maybe I'll do a part 2 and test even more rye flours and see how they compare to the reigning champions here on the board today. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Finish Your Plate.